Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts Sam Foote
and Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Microsoft 365 focused IT security professionals.
It's episode 18 of season 4. Sam and I had a recent discussion around external identities and how Microsoft Entra can assist. Microsoft Entra External ID brings the B2B and B2C capability under one umbrella. Here are a few things we covered. What are B2B and B2C identities? How are these identities used? What is Microsoft Entra Multi-tenant organization? And how are these identities licensed?
We have noticed a large number of you aren't subscribed. If you do enjoy our podcast, please do consider subscribing. It would mean a lot to us for you to show your support to the show.
It's a really great episode, so let's dive in.
Hey Alan, how are you doing this week?
Hey Sam, not doing too bad. It's been a busy week, as always.
Yeah, exactly. And lots of security co-pilot news starting to drop now. It feels like in the build up to Ignite, we're seeing more and more sort of being drip fed to us.
Yeah, this week we had some of the official sort of documentation on Microsoft Learn. Now it's not Microsoft Docs. That changed quite some time ago, but we're starting to see some of the documentation now coming out to sort of explain what it is and some of the scenarios. So yeah, it's starting to be more visible. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really good to start to see more information about it. It's interesting. Microsoft's LLM AI being layered over the top of security operations. So yeah, it's really interesting to see that technology, and I sort of can't wait to get my hands on it and have a play around with it. It's going to be interesting to see how effective it is and what benefits and ROI you really get out of it.
Yeah, and we're now starting to understand exactly what products it will start to sort of sit on top of, like Microsoft Intune, Sentinel, and Defender for Endpoint. So as sort of the initial start to it all. So yeah, definitely we can start seeing where we need to focus on making sure we got that data for it to consume and help SecOps where it can.
Yeah, exactly. So this week, Alan, external identities.
Yeah, this was a
Okay.
This was a request that one of our listeners sort of brought in. So I thought we'd cover it because it's something that we haven't done yet as well. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, let's get started. So Alan, can you give us a sort of a bird's eye view, high level overview of what Microsoft Entra External ID is?
Yeah, so Microsoft Entra External IDs is really the sort of umbrella name for a couple of sort of technologies that have been in play in the sort of Azure AD or Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft Entra space for some time now. But so it's kind of as it kind of sounds, it's it's your external identities that you can use either within your Microsoft 365 tenant or your Microsoft Entra ID tenant, or it could be your in effect your consumer identities for your application. So when we talk, like when I say sort of B2B, I'm talking to business, so tenant to tenant. And then you've got B2C, which is business to customer, business to consumer around it. So that's the kind of like high level sort of areas. But there's also this this new area that's in preview around Microsoft Entra multi-tenant organizations. And we'll talk about that sort of later. So yeah, there are a couple of things around B2B. Like I said, it's been there for some time. But yeah, we can dive into that in a bit.
So really, it's a sort of set of technologies and controls for how you as an organization would interact with other external, well, literally external identities, right? Be that B2B, B2C, It's really that collaborative technology that it's not just Entra ID being your internal identities, but it's also bringing in other externals into sort of your environment.
Yeah, being able to collaborate with other organizations, or they might be sister companies and be part of your like global organization, or might just be partners, or just maybe customers that are still organizations, and then you've got consumers. As I said, bringing consumers into your, not to say into your environment directly, but maybe into your applications that you're hosting and things like that. So yeah, external entities, external parties being able to authenticate against your identity, and you provide the access, kind of thing.
And I suppose a question that I've got is that, is this all new technologies and new concepts, or was there ways to previously have this type of collaboration? Pre Entra ID, Azure AD. How would you have done it traditionally?
So before, well, so B2B, B2C has been around for some time now with the branding of Azure AD. So that's been around for some time. There is some advances in those technologies since, and we'll go through those sort of later. But before you had Office 365, and if we're going that far back now, being able to collaborate with an external party, you'd have to allow them access to a web service or something on premise or in Azure, but you have to directly connect to the IaaS or PaaS service, and either that would be local identities to that application, or it would be secret authentication against your Active Directory, so on premise sort of authentication. So it probably was quite difficult and complex to try to set that up without it and also being secure, because in effect you're opening a portal up for in the past brute force attacks against your application, against your identities.
And would sort of traditional IT, would that type of collaboration just not happened? Like have things like Teams and OneDrive, etc., driven the need for this type of collaboration? Is it just new technology that's driven it, or would you have done that previously, or would you have shared data in a different way?
I think you have shared data in a different way, because there's always been a need to collaborate, with information. You send an email with all of your attachments, your Word documents. Now, in today's world, you would potentially share that via SharePoint or OneDrive, so you don't have to share a copy of it. So it's not like 2 or 3 copies of the same data, kind of thing. And once it's sent in an email, then you can't, without using other technology like Purview Information Protection, you can't control who has access to that data once it leaves in that email. So leaving it on your data at rest, on your tenant, and other users consuming it is potentially more secure, or at least there's more controls, at least, about what they can do with it.
Okay, so yeah, let's go through some of the use cases then. So in what scenarios is B2B used?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about this a little bit. So there's two types now for B2B collaboration. One of them being B2B collaboration, but one of them being the new one being B2B Direct Connect. And B2B collaboration is where we invite a user into your Microsoft Entra ID tenant as a guest. So they have a placeholder, a guest account in your tenant, which is tied to their identity on their like home tenant, which then you can then give access to applications, resources, SharePoint sites, Teams, and things like that. And a lot of people have used this potentially. So if you wanted to talk to somebody, if you were a guest user and you're using Microsoft Teams, you have to, in effect, do a switch tenant. So you switch over to the external tenant as the user that has been invited. And then you can then see what the Microsoft Teams in that remote tenant and then collaborate within the teams you're allowed access to. It might be that you've been B2B'd into access an application they have that they single sign on into. It might be access to their AWS environment or their Azure environment. Maybe you're an MSP looking after a customer's Azure and infrastructure. So that's one of the scenarios. The B2B Direct is new, and this is in effect creating a trust between the two tenants. So this is saying what a user is allowed to do between those tenants, and that could then bring into the new. It's not necessarily new now, but it is still. I think it's the last 6 months, 12 months that it's been out. But the Microsoft Teams shared channels, where you a hosting tenant creates a shared channel, and then they share it with the external tenant, and in effect within Microsoft Teams, that user can either add it to another team their side, and in effect it mirrors that channel into their tenant, so they don't have to do that switch tenant, which is quite powerful, really, because it feels from the user perspective very seamless with that, even though the data is stored on the hosting tenant there. So that's kind of the two ways of using that. Like I said, it's mainly around tenant-to-tenant interactions and accessing SaaS applications that are in in one of the tenants and things like that.
Nice, that's great. I'm guessing that just really does enable effective and secure collaboration between organizations, right? It's that fine-grained relationships that can be defined and I suppose monitored.
Yeah, and in effect, those users coming in, you can then, using conditional access, control what they do to have access. So it could be they have to do multi-factor authentication. They have to come from a certain IP address, that kind of thing. So you can then lock down that access to your SharePoint OneDrive environments, all those SaaS, those other SaaS applications that you're allowing them into.
Nice. So on the B2C side, can you give us some scenarios where that's used?
Yes. So just for clarity, I've not really used this in anger. I've more been in the B2B space, so don't shoot me if I get anything wrong. So B2C is more around providing identities for your application or website for your consumers or your customers to use. So this is a external identity provider that you can use then with any application that you create or any website that you create to provide an identity, so you can give permissions to certain areas. So this could be your shopping website, this could be your data repository, and you need to provide access to it. And really, that's the sort of the main goal with it. But also, there's custom development apps. You can, if you've got single sign-in into other SaaS applications that are out there, you can use it for that. But one of the main things is that the users can bring their own identities. So this could be a local identity that is in the B2C tenant. So when you do this, when you set up Microsoft Entra B2C, in effect, you spin up a new Azure AD. I'm getting them all mixed up now because it's still in my mind about Azure AD, but Microsoft Entra ID sort of tenant, and then the users go in there. But then you can use external identities like Facebook, Gmail, and some other ones out there, as well as potentially government IDs, to do that sign in for you. So you have other identity providers that a user can use, because a lot of consumers will have a Gmail, a Facebook, a Instagram, an Apple ID kind of thing, and they can just reuse that to in effect have an identity within your application. And B2C in effect, collects some identifiers for your app, for your your identity in those external ones, so it can cross-reference you. But in effect, that then allows those users to have access to your application or to your SaaS applications that are sat in the background. And in effect, this is sort of classed as a customer identity access management system, a CIAM. And like I said, it can use SSO, SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth. It can also be B2B users. So you can use an Azure AD or a Microsoft Entra ID identity to also go into that B2C environment. And sort of some of the great things around this is that previously, it was just that, but it was just that sort of data store. But in the last year, 18 months, Microsoft allowed you to use, change the sort of pricing sort of around it, and in effect allowed you to have conditional access and any P1, P2 capability within that tenant. So now they've added that enhanced security to it, which is great. So you can do MFA, potentially some access reviews and some risky user kind of things. One great thing as well is that the sign-in interface, you can in effect pretty much customize to what you need to meet your apps or your app or website sort of themes and your I can't think of the word of it now, but in effect you have like full control of the HTML and the CSS for it.
Yeah, I've used B2C previously to, instead of roll our own identity service effectively, you utilize it because a lot of development teams, I'll say back in my day, used to roll their own identity providers, and there are frameworks out there that you can effectively roll local identity providers, but those identities are so risky, right? Especially in breach scenarios, around password reuse and the security of those credentials, right? And any private PII information, etc., right? So there has been a general trend in sort of outsourcing and offloading that identity provider to a third party. Now, there's lots of various different systems that you can, and even actual companies that do it. But I think what's great about B2C is that you're effectively reusing, and I don't know how it works under the hood, obviously, but you're reusing a lot of that technology that's there, on the Entra ID. I'll call it like normal mode, if that makes sense, right? And to also be able to do things like MFA and conditional access with it as well, you're starting to add a layer of protection that is from my experience, not there when devising your own solution, right? So the fact that you can get full control of that, you can integrate with other identity providers as well, so people can reuse their identities as well, is a big bonus there.
Yeah, and you're right. If you built your own, one, you've got to manage it. One, you've got to update it to keep it secure. If you want MFA, then yes, you've got to build that capability in, or jump out to a third-party solution to bring that MFA in. You've then got to potentially got to build your interfaces to manage those identities. If, from an application management perspective, not necessarily from a user side. user might want to update all of their like information, so you've got to provide that sort of view of it, plus all your sign up pages, things like that. This is, and building all those security controls that conditional access can do. Checking what IP they're coming from, any risky sign-ins, things like that. Without, not saying anyone couldn't build it, but you're adding a lot of time into your build, and this is almost, I need this, I'm going to spin up a tenant, I put my my requirements into what identities are allowed to sign in, things like that, all my conditional access, and now I just need to hook up my application. And I've never done this, so I don't know if it is that simple, but in effect, you've got your identity store there ready to be integrated within your application. And Microsoft do provide you with sample codes for your .NETs and things like that to be able to integrate with it. So it is all sort of, does feel like it's there on a plate to basically just like consume and let Microsoft do all the hard work for you.
Yeah, you've obviously got to have a level of development knowledge, right, and to be able to integrate it. But I think if you take the simplicity of it versus rolling your own, and what these developers are having to do before this, right? This is like you say, click, done, SDK, integrate, go, right? I can imagine that some people may be cautious of outsourcing something quite so vital. It's quite natural for us because we're in like sort of Microsoft's ecosystem a lot, right? So it's kind of a no-brainer, really. But I can imagine some people that want to be able to not be vendor locked, and things like that. There could be concerns around that, and if you don't trust cloud providers with your identities, there could be that. But then you wouldn't really be looking at a hosted and managed solution anyway, But I think if you are an organization that is currently using Entra ID, adopting Entra ID B2C is like a logical next step, right? It's aligned into the ecosystem. It's also using, from a SecOps perspective, it's utilizing a lot of the same tooling and the same terminology and understanding. So it feels quite natural to start using that type of system.
Yeah, and probably a lot of organizations or users are probably, potentially where they work now as well, they're probably used to sort of the Microsoft Entra ID authentication window and things like that. Whilst you can customize it, they are very used to it. And I've seen some of the one of the water providers in the UK, utilities, using B2C. I've just seen it because of the URL it goes to. I've been like, oh, there's B2C here, but didn't notice it from the start, kind of thing. So it is kind of hidden that it is that technology. But again, from a security perspective, you can see that the Microsoft Entra environment is so large now, with multiple organizations just using it for their internal identities now. Such a big ecosystem there that Microsoft are looking after. There's so many protections there, and you're just sort of just jumping on that for your consumers.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, can we talk about sort of licensing and costs? Is it enterprise ready but also enterprise cost?
So they used to be. So let's probably talk about back in the day, back in the past. We've used that twice now. That in effect for B2B, so B2B and B2C kind of used to be sort of separate tooling. And then it sort of came into sort of one sort of scenario kind of thing, and then put under the external ID sort of umbrella. But originally, B2B used to be that guests could be invited, and if you wanted to use any security products, in effect, you had for every one license you had for your internal users, you could use 5 for guest users. So if you had 100, it means you'd have 500 for guests. in effect. They were, you never seen those licenses. It was more of a, that's kind of like what you get with it. And that was great because some organizations have little guests, because most of them are internal, but it meant that you could apply MFA, use conditional access on them. And if you were P2 as well, it means you could use identity protection as well to check, make sure they were not risky when they're coming in. And then quite some time ago, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, I think it was, they then brought in this new sort of model. In effect, you change over to it if you already had a tenant, and basically you sign up a Azure subscription to your Microsoft Entra ID tenant. And then you get, then it's based on monthly active usage, so it's like a consumption at that point. Now, it seemed, when we initially heard about that, being sort of quite bad, because at the moment, in effect, you got them free. But when you dive into it, the first 50,000 external identities, so B2B users or your B2C users, are free. So from a an organization using B2B with their external parties, quite a lot of organizations probably are not going to hit that 50,000 MAU. There will be organizations that will, don't get me wrong, but generally I don't think many will hit that monthly active usage for their internal users. So I think that's great. And even for your B2C, if you've got 50,000 consumers talking to your application, which is probably likely, if you've got an application that is, heavily used, then your first 50,000 are free. And that includes your P1 and your P2, as far as I'm aware, capability from an Entra ID perspective. So that gives you conditional access, multi-factor, and your, identity protection, your risky users. So I think that's pretty crazy. I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, because I wonder if you plotted all of the web applications in the world and and did a histogram of how many monthly active users they had, I bet the vast majority would be under that 50,000, right, of all the web apps that are out there. Like if you had a B2B SaaS business, you could have a very sizable business with 50,000 and it's monthly active users as well. So it's not, it's also who logs in, if you've got sort of stale accounts, people not logging in, they're not counted every month unless they actually log in, right? I assume it's consumption billed at that point, right? At the end of every month. So yeah, really good.
Yeah. So now the price for over 50,000. And so there's two prices. There's one for P1 capability and one for P2 capability. So in dollars per user, per monthly active user, this is 0.00. Well, so it's probably 0.325 cents for a P1 license.
Yeah, I worked out to $3.25 per 1,000 users per month.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So do you have to take at least a P1?
Yeah, that's the minimum one. So you by default get conditional access and MFA and password reset, things like that.
Right. Okay. So you get your first 50,000 free, and then if you want everybody else, have everybody on P1, you'll then pay $3.25 per 1,000 monthly active users per month after that.
Yeah. And then the P2 price is 1.625 cents, which I guess is $16.25.
Yeah, $16.25 per 1,000. And what do you get for P2? For your extra?
So that will then include the identity protection side of things, so risky users, where they're coming from, that sort of stuff, so to see if they've been compromised, that kind of thing. So, if they're coming from a known bad IP address or, Tor browser, etc., they can be classed as risky and not come in, or maybe you enhance the MFA kind of thing.
Okay, so P1, you sort of get your static rules, if that makes sense, your conditional access, your MFA, and that settings. And then P2 is really starting to get adaptive access at that point, right? You know, and actually, feeding in other intelligence signals into those logins.
Yeah, and so that's kind of it around the licensing cost. So, it's a great. There's no really barrier to entry to start, because if you're developing, you're going to use your test accounts, aren't you, at that point? And you're going to have like 5 or 10, and they're going to be in the free tier, so you can have it all there. You can start building all of your conditional access, testing it all, and and your app integrations, and then when you're ready to launch, it's there. And you don't, and I guess that's another great thing about it, is you don't have to scale it. It's just just there, and it can consume what you need.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that, for me, the front door element of it is really powerful. If you're the size of organization that's got 50,000 monthly active users, there is a potential there for you to be, well, anybody, but to be more vulnerable to like a denial of service attack, etc. Right? And there, every endpoint, every process that you have to cover with that is extra cost, right? And Microsoft are effectively saying, hey, use our hosted service. We'll give you the first 50,000 monthly active users for free. I suppose it could really add up then. I suppose P2 could add up, right? Because if you're 100,000 monthly active users, let me just do that in those numbers. That's $1,600 a month for another 100. You'd have 150,000 monthly active users for $1,600 a month. I suppose in my mind, I've got to think about, for $1,600 a month, could I pay somebody to maintain it? The answer is probably no. And host the thing.
Yeah.
There's many different things to think about there. Plus, multi-factor authentication, right? Because if I'm rolling my own, I have to get feature parity, I have to also support all of these different things like conditional access, identity protection, etc. Right?
Yeah, that, or you've got to go out to a third party that can provide that for you and pay per user for that, to be able to do, send out a text message, or have a one-time password, etc.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah.
That sounds really. I obviously don't know how that scales, right? Because I've never used that at that level, right? So it would be interesting to hear from somebody that has B2C at over 50,000, monthly active users, right? To see if it's actually economically viable at that scale. But to me, I feel like you would have a very big business if you had 50,000 monthly active users, right? And you could probably support. Because it might be that you've got a true B2C, maybe you're running like a social network as an example, right? You might not need P2. You might not go to that level, because what's the risk there? Right? You might have like sort of pseudo public information, people's pictures of their dinners at restaurants and whatnot on Instagram. Like the content that you're protecting there might not actually be that as valuable, right? Because there's different sort of classification levels there. So it might be that P1 for certain amount of your users is absolutely fine, or maybe even all of them. And at that point, it's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Even just having the P1 is so powerful. It's the same thing with Microsoft Entra ID.
Yeah.
Having that P1 is essential, really, or the equivalent of, depending on how you get that capability. Whether it's business premium, things like that. But
yeah, and it'll just be the sensitivity of that data and a balance of risk, right, versus ROI. But I suppose as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, with identity protection, that's just like a turn on sort of deal, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's not that
obviously
onerous,
setting up
is it?
setting up some conditional access for it, just so you're using those signals to do something, be adaptive with your access.
But identity protection gives you those signals with very minimal configuration, doesn't it? It's
Correct.
like black box, right? So what you can do is you can consume that P2 license with very little SME knowledge, right? Because you've got to modify your conditional access policies that you created in your P1, right? But layering on P2, to me, just seems like it's a commercial and a risk decision more than it is anything else, right? So that is also quite powerful, that you can just like set and forget, right? Like the biggest decision is who's going to pay for it, and that's the CFO's problem, right? At that point, right? So that seems pretty powerful to me. That user experience of moving between those levels, or developer experience of moving between those levels, is almost frictionless, except for commercials.
Yeah, definitely, and you can as well, not necessarily around the pricing side of things. You can also do some verification of someone's identity as well, and in effect, the workflow of someone signing up could go to a third party proofing, capability. Maybe they've put some details about where where they live, things like that, and then you need to validate it to prove their identity, kind of thing. So I think you can hook it up to some things like that as well, so you can have the extra checks when the people sign up.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. A sort of scenario that I've sort of been thinking about as you've been talking is mergers and acquisitions, larger multinational organizations. So some organizations I work with have multiple tenants, and how does this sort of fit that? Because organizations that have multiple tenants are kind of like B2B tenants, really, and they can actually be isolated, from a corporate structure perspective. So does any of this technology help there?
Yeah, so you're right. They, in effect, they are B2B sort of scenarios, not the B2C side of things. But with the new sort of B2B direct and things like that, that helps with because really, they can collaborate, but it's not maybe the greatest experience, because they have to switch tenants to find out who they are. When they're sending an email, they don't necessarily see everyone from the other organizations, without someone creating contacts and trying to keep that up to date, etc. So there's a couple of things. So Microsoft brought in this cross-tenant synchronization, and in effect, you can synchronize users between, in effect, automatically B2B collaborate, invite them into the other tenant, and then when they leave, they then get removed. So it's kind of, if like you said, if you've got a merger and acquisition, they can automatically, you can almost like set up automatic B2B into that tenant, that remote tenant, and vice versa, can be two-way sync. So that then allows, that automatic, as I keep saying, inviting of that user to that tenant, and offboarding as well, based on the source tenant managing that. So that's really good. That stops having to request to be invited and that kind of thing. But there's something in preview at the moment called multi-tenant organization, and in effect, you from my understanding of it, in effect, you create this like sort of umbrella, or this like entity that says, we're a multi-tenant organization, and then you in effect attach the tenants to that that multi-tenant organization, and then you can do things like the synchronization with the other tenants as well, or sort of semi-automatically in effect. But the users, from what I understand, are sort of classified as external members rather than guest members. So they kind of are identified as like an internal user, but their identity is external, kind of thing. And you can still have your standard B2B guests, none out of that multi-tenant organization sort of coming in as well. But the kind of benefit to this is it's using, the collaboration, the B2B collaboration, but also the B2B direct sort of scenario. And what it allows, from my understanding, because I've never used it yet, is that you can now also directly collaborate in teams around those tenants. Could be using in effect shared channels, and I think there might be some other functionality. But also when you're doing emails, things like that, I think you can search for users and you can collaborate a lot easier. And that's kind of what I'm seeing from the documentation, and that it's just a better experience for users when they're in that scenario, because that is it's the worst thing of you've done an acquisition or a merger, etc., or you, like you said, Sam, you've got a multinational organization that have got tenants in their regions, due to sovereignty of data and things like that. And you need to be able to collaborate easily. That is one of the trickiest parts. And there are solutions out there to sort of try and help with that. But Microsoft now bringing that into this ecosystem now. So it's definitely feels like it's it's the next stage of that merging of multi-tenants there.
It's such a common scenario as well, right? We see it with larger organizations. I'm going to say more often than not, really, to be totally honest with you, right? So it's great that is a thing. I think that's gonna really help and simplify things, and I think generally that's going to help with that, just shifting more and more into the cloud, right, and letting having that more joined up ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. And to be fair, I don't think, thinking about it, we talk about Microsoft Entra ID quite a lot, but I don't think we've actually done an episode on the concept of having a cloud identity and synchronization with Active Directory and everything. It's like something we've completely missed out of everything.
It's almost like the foundation, the building blocks, right? So are you signing yourself up for a Entra ID? It's the right time to do an episode on it, Alan, because they have changed the name. So, I'm going to call it that we were just waiting for the rebrand, right? And that's why.
Yeah, maybe I'll do that in a couple of weeks' time.
Okay, cool. Anything else that you want to cover, Alan? I think you've given us a good overview there.
No, I think that's. I think I've done fairly good with it. Sorry if I've butchered B2C. I hope I haven't. But yeah. The only other things is some of our previous episodes, and again we've talked about some of the capability in Microsoft Entra ID, but never talked about Entra ID directly. So we got some things like identity governance, which is quite an old episode actually now, which is season 2, episode 10. So we probably need to revisit that. Season 3, episode 1, Azure MFA, and season 3, episode 4, we did privileged identity management. Again, one of the other capabilities. So yeah, if you want to continue sort of the journey of learning about Microsoft Entra ID, check those ones out, and we'll continue to sort of add some other ones in as we've forgotten the foundational side of things. So yeah. So Sam, what's next week's episode?
I'm going to cover Azure DDoS protection. DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. It's essentially a sort of a attack mechanism where adversaries will attempt to overwhelm a system with a flood of data, effectively, to a target system. And what can happen is it can choke up sort of multiple layers of your network stack to interface into your application, and with a lot of managed and hosted products, distributed denial of service protection is built in, so it's something that you don't need to worry about. But if you do have your own a need for interfacing, let's say, your web servers out to the internet, you can layer on DDoS protection on top to give you that protection. So I'm going to do an episode on covering that and what the benefits are and how it works.
Okay, great. Yeah, it'd be worth getting some of those. If we can find some of those stats where Microsoft have stopped a huge DDoS attack against them.
Exactly.
Some crazy numbers there, if I remember. So, yeah, that'd be good. I think that'd be a good episode. Okay, so did you enjoy this episode? If so, please do consider leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify. This really helps reach out to more people like you. If you have any specific feedback or suggestions, we have a link in our show notes to get in contact with us.
And if you've made it this far, thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yep, thanks all.